My name is Gabriel Allen, and I remember this happened back in 2012, deep in the Ouachita National Forest, Arkansas. I had planned this RV camping trip to break out of my routine as a tax consultant. I didn't exactly have the wildest schedule, and every so often, the quiet drove me up the wall. So I packed up, got my RV loaded with snacks, fishing gear, and a couple of mystery novels, and set off, aiming to unwind, eat some terrible campfire meals, and maybe catch a fish or two if I was lucky. The Ouachita stretches for miles, and you can drive for hours without seeing another soul. Perfect for a guy who needs some isolation therapy. I found a spot nestled between tall, unbothered pines and parked. It was far enough off any main trail to make it feel like I was in my own little slice of wilderness heaven, yet close enough that if I twisted my ankle or ran out of supplies, it wouldn't be a total disaster. The first night was peaceful, just the sound of crickets and the occasional rustling. I even caught myself chuckling at how silly it was to be so jittery at the slightest forest sound. By the next afternoon, I'd already fallen into the calm of the place. After grilling up some truly unfortunate hamburgers, I decided to take a hike to stretch my legs and maybe scout for a better fishing spot along the creek. I'd barely made it 100 yards from my RV when I noticed something strange, a dead rabbit hanging from a tree just a few feet off the trail. Now, I'm no stranger to odd sights in the woods, but this was different. The rabbit's body was stiff, dangling by what looked like a homemade snare, some kind of rough twine twisted around its neck. Maybe someone local had been out trapping and just left it there by mistake, I thought, trying to brush off the odd feeling settling in my gut. But as I walked back toward my RV, I noticed two more animals, small birds this time, hung from branches in a similar way, like little macabre decorations. The strange thing was, there wasn't a hint of decay. They couldn't have been hanging there for more than a few hours. Suddenly, my peaceful camping trip felt less like a retreat and more like I'd stumbled onto something I wasn't meant to see. I picked up my pace back to the RV, thinking it might be best to move spots, maybe a little closer to a trailhead. But as soon as I got back to my site, I saw something else. Footprints. Bare human footprints. They trailed around my RV, leading up to the door and looping back around toward the tree line. My first thought was maybe some prankster kids were trying to mess with me, but the prints were large, much too big for kids, and they were fresh. I could still see the damp impressions in the forest floor. The quiet was different now. It felt like the whole forest had gone dead silent, and every little crackle of a branch felt amplified. I climbed into the RV, closed the door, and locked it, for all the good it would do. I sat down, trying to decide what to do next. My phone had no reception out here, so calling for help wasn't an option. I figured I'd sleep with one eye open, maybe head back out in the morning. The night was tense. I heard what I thought were branches snapping nearby, footsteps shuffling around my RV. Every time I turned off the interior lights to look outside, I saw nothing, just darkness pressing against the windows. Around midnight, I heard a soft scraping sound against the side of the RV, like someone dragging their hand across the metal. I grabbed the closest thing I had to a weapon, a fishing knife, and sat there waiting, barely breathing. The scraping sound moved, circling the RV, slow and deliberate. Then it stopped, and everything went quiet. By dawn, I was exhausted, running on nothing but stale coffee and nerves. I stepped outside, hoping daylight might make me feel less paranoid, but I quickly noticed something that sent a chill up my spine. The footprints were back, fresh, leading directly to my RV door and back to the tree line, where they disappeared into the brush. I was done. I decided right then to pack up and head out. I was only halfway through loading everything back into the RV when I heard it, a low, strained voice from somewhere in the trees. Leaving already? I froze, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might actually burst. I scanned the trees, but saw no one. I yelled out something unintelligible, something about this not being funny and calling the police, but the voice chuckled, mocking, cold. "Oh, I'm just getting started," it said, echoing through the trees like it was coming from everywhere at once. The voice was rough, a growl underneath, not like anything I'd ever heard from a human. But it had to be a person. I told myself that over and over. I finished packing as fast as I could, throwing things haphazardly into the RV, and climbed into the driver's seat, ready to get the hell out of there. But when I turned the key, the engine sputtered, coughed, and died. I tried again. Nothing. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely grip the wheel, and in a panic, I jumped out, thinking maybe I could fix whatever was wrong if I opened up the hood. When I did, my stomach dropped. All the wiring was shredded. It looked like someone had taken a knife to every crucial part of the engine. In a blind panic, I decided my only option was to make a break for it on foot. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed it with water and snacks, and took off toward the nearest trailhead I'd seen when I drove in. It was supposed to be about 3 miles out, reachable if I kept up a good pace. I'd barely made it 10 minutes into my walk when I heard the footsteps behind me. Soft at first, like someone trying to match my steps. I quickened my pace. The footsteps followed. When I broke into a run, the footsteps behind me sped up too. And that's when I finally turned around. There he was, a hulking figure, close enough now that I could make out the twisted grin on his face, teeth bared in a half smile that didn't reach his cold, sunken eyes. His hair was long, tangled, hanging over his shoulders like a matted mane, and he wore clothes so ragged they barely clung to his body. The worst part was his hands, long, clawed fingers that he flexed like he was itching to use them. I kept running, my mind racing through every mistake I'd made on this trip, every stupid decision that had led me here. I could hear him gaining on me, the heavy sound of his boots pounding the ground. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I remembered reading that people who live out here sometimes go a little feral. Whatever drove this man to the woods had taken every last piece of humanity from him, leaving nothing but a wild animal in human form. Up ahead, I saw what looked like a ranger station, just an old, weather-beaten cabin on stilts. It was a long shot, but if I could get inside and lock the door, maybe I'd have a chance. I pushed myself harder, lungs burning, and made it to the cabin, throwing myself up the steps and slamming the door behind me. I wasn't safe yet, and I knew it. I bolted it shut, every nerve in my body firing as I pressed my back against the wood, trying to catch my breath. Outside, I could hear his footsteps slowing, then stopping. A shadow fell over the window, and then I heard it again. That voice. Low, mocking. "You can't hide from me. Not out here." He pressed his face to the window, his grin widening, those teeth glinting in the dull morning light. He was holding something in his hand, a small, tattered notebook worn down with age. He opened it, and that's when I saw the names written inside, each one crossed out, followed by a crude sketch of the forest, a line leading to a little X. My name was the last one on the list. I felt something shift inside me, a primal surge of fight or flight that almost drove me to open the door and charge him head on. Instead, I grabbed the first thing I saw, a rusted fire poker by the cabin's old stove, and held it out like a weapon. The man laughed, a harsh guttural sound that bounced off the trees outside. "You're not the first," he sneered. "But you're the last. Today, anyway." He backed up a few steps as if giving me a head start, and I took the opportunity to scan the cabin. There was an old radio on the counter, and I scrambled over, twisting the knobs, praying for even the faintest signal. Static crackled, and then, miraculously, a voice came through, muffled but there. "This is Ranger Station 14. Do you copy?" "Yes," I shouted, breathless. "Please, I'm in trouble. There's someone." Before I could finish, the window shattered. The man's hand shot through, clawing at the air, barely missing me. I ducked down, clutching the radio like a lifeline as he banged against the door, each hit harder than the last. "Just you and me now," he growled, his voice rising into a manic, almost gleeful tone. "No one's coming." The banging grew louder, more forceful, and I knew the door wouldn't hold. In a last-ditch effort, I pulled a chair up under the door handle, grabbed the fire poker, and braced myself. The door splintered, and he stepped through, eyes gleaming with an unholy excitement. He lunged toward me, but I swung the poker, catching him across the face. He staggered back, laughing, a sick, twisted laugh that echoed through the cabin. Blood dripped from a gash on his cheek, and he wiped it away, smearing it like war paint across his face. I charged, swinging the poker again, and this time it hit hard enough that he dropped to one knee. But he was strong, almost inhumanly so, and he grabbed my wrist, twisting it until the poker fell from my grip. He pushed me to the ground, his hand around my throat, and I could feel his hot breath against my face as he leaned in close. "See, the thing about the woods," he whispered, "is they swallow up people like you." With a sudden burst of strength, I shoved him off, scrambling to my feet. He lunged again, but this time, I was ready. I grabbed the fire poker and plunged it into his chest. He staggered, his mouth opening in a silent scream as he fell backward, clutching the poker embedded in his chest. I didn't wait to see if he'd get up again. I ran out of that cabin, not stopping until I reached the trailhead. The Rangers found him the next day, dead and stiff on the cabin floor. They said his name was Elroy Fitch, a local who had gone missing a decade earlier, only to resurface now as some kind of feral predator. His journal was filled with sketches of his victims' final paths through the woods. They didn't ask me much, just took my statement and told me to get some rest. I left that day, my RV untouched, his final words echoing in my mind. The woods swallow up people like you. It all started with an offhand joke. You hear enough bad jokes in my line of work, but this one stood out. It was 2004, somewhere deep in the North Carolina woods, the kind of place tourists don't even know exists. I had been on 100 missions before, but this one seemed simple. Find the locals who had gone missing and bring them back, dead or alive. I joined the Green Berets for the adrenaline, for the chance to do something meaningful. But over the years, that rush started to fade, until that damn joke. Some of the local cops, the ones I was meant to coordinate with, had this thing where they'd whisper around me like they were afraid to say something out loud. One of them, a big guy named Remy, who always chewed tobacco and spat on his own boots, leaned in one night while I was cleaning my rifle and said, "The woods don't like strangers much. They got their own rules. And yeah, sometimes they eat folks who break them." I remember rolling my eyes and grunting something about old wives' tales, but it stuck with me. I mean, I'd been through enough to know that when locals get weird, there's usually a reason. So I took it as a heads up, though I didn't believe in superstitions. Not then, anyway. By the time we got out there, me, Remy, and a few other locals we picked up, the sun was slipping low behind the trees, giving us just enough time to set up a base camp. I didn't like the idea of working with the local guys, especially Remy, who cracked more jokes than a man should, but orders are orders. One of them, Pete, had lived out here all his life. He swore he'd seen bears doing strange things, but I didn't pay it much mind. Bears don't take people whole, and they sure as hell don't drag them away without leaving a mess. Remy, Pete, and I split up to cover more ground. Remy took the creek bed. Pete took the ridge above it. That left me with the thickest part of the woods, where the trees leaned in close like a suffocating crowd. I could feel the humidity seeping through my clothes. The air smelled like pine, and something rotten underneath. It wasn't long before I found my first clue. A bloody shirt, half buried under a pile of leaves. Like something had tried to hide it, but didn't care to do it right. The thing about finding blood is, it's never a good sign. But this wasn't the splatter of a struggle or the spray you get when something big goes down. No, this was something else. Methodical. I pressed on, radioing Remy and Pete every 15 minutes like we'd planned. No answers, but I could hear faint static, just enough to know the radios weren't dead. It's just that they weren't responding. By dusk, I found more. Pieces of a tent, torn like they'd been shredded by claws, though not the kind you'd expect. No signs of struggle, no trap, just a creeping sense that something was off. Then I found the bones, not scattered, not chewed, laid out in a pattern. Deliberate, like someone had taken their time setting them out, like a child making a stick figure in the dirt. There was no mistaking it. Human. I cracked another joke over the radio, something dumb about arts and crafts, but got nothing back. The silence sat heavy, but I pushed on. Maybe they were messing with me, trying to scare the new guy from out of town. That's when I heard it, a snapping sound, low to the ground, like someone or something breaking branches. I kept my rifle at the ready and pushed through a thicket. That's when I spotted Remy's body, or at least what was left of it, slumped against a tree, his guts spilled out like someone had unzipped him. There was no sign of Pete. I didn't get close enough to see much more because of what stood over Remy's corpse. It looked like a wolf. If wolves walked on two legs, its fur was matted, dripping with blood that wasn't its own. Its teeth, longer, thinner than they should be, gleamed in the dim light. It didn't look right, didn't move right. My first thought was that maybe it was a man, some freaky local in a getup, trying to scare me. But then it crouched low, sniffing at the air, and I knew better. This thing wasn't interested in me, at least not yet. I dropped down, hoping the thick brush would hide me. My breath came out in short bursts. My heart pounded so loud I thought it might hear me. I didn't have a clean shot, and this wasn't the kind of thing you wanted to miss. I watched it turn its head, almost like it was listening for something. Then it stood up and started walking toward the trees. Its limbs moved in jerky, unnatural ways, and I got the impression that whatever it was, it didn't belong in a world that made sense. I waited until it was far enough, then crawled back to where Remy lay, took what was left of his radio, and tried to call for backup. Static. Just static. Pete still wasn't responding either. I thought about turning back to camp, but I couldn't leave without knowing what happened to Pete. Maybe he found a way out. Maybe he was just lost in the dark. Or maybe he wasn't. I found Pete an hour later, hanging from a tree, his neck twisted at an impossible angle. Below him, more bones. Some fresh, some old. There was a skull, cracked open like a walnut, and for the first time in my life, I was scared in a way I hadn't been, even when bullets were flying. This wasn't just about some missing folks anymore. This was a burial ground, a damn feeding ground. I've seen death before, but not like this, not methodical, not like a ritual. I radioed again, whispering this time, as if keeping my voice low might make me less real to whatever was out there. My rifle felt heavy, useless, but I kept it clutched in my hands like a lifeline. I needed to find a way back, but then I heard that same snapping sound, closer this time. It didn't come from the ground. It came from above. That's when I saw them. More of those things, climbing through the treetops like giant bats, their limbs twisting around branches like they had extra joints. There were at least 3 of them, but they moved so fast I couldn't keep count. I stayed perfectly still, hoping they'd miss me, but one of them leapt down, landing in front of me with a soft thud, like a cat dropping from a fence. I didn't think. I fired, 3 rounds into its chest. It staggered back, but the thing didn't go down. It shrieked, not like an animal, not like anything I had ever heard. A kind of sound that drilled into your skull and rattled around in your head. But it bled, and that gave me a sliver of hope. I fired again, aiming for its head, and this time it dropped, twitching on the ground like a dying fish. The others noticed. They dropped from the trees, their claws scraping bark as they hit the ground. I ran. I've never run so fast in my life, and I didn't look back, not even when I heard them crashing through the underbrush behind me. My legs burned, my lungs felt like they were tearing apart, but I ran until I stumbled into a clearing and saw the lights of a cabin up ahead. I crashed through the door, slamming it shut behind me. An old man sat in a rickety chair by the fireplace, staring at me like I had just interrupted his dinner. He didn't seem surprised to see a soldier covered in blood, carrying a smoking rifle. He just looked at me, his expression flat, like he was watching a rerun of a TV show he'd seen 1,000 times before. I asked him if he had a phone, a radio, anything. He just shook his head and said, "They come for what they want, and then they leave. Always have." He didn't blink, didn't flinch, just stared past me like he was looking through the walls. He started talking about the woods like they were alive, about how sometimes the forest decides who stays and who goes. I didn't have time for his riddles. I barricaded the windows, checked my ammunition, and asked him if he knew a way out. He just laughed, This low, gravelly sound that echoed in the small room. You don't get out, son. You just survive. And then he went quiet, staring into the flames as if that was all that mattered. I watched through the window as the things circled the cabin, their silhouettes barely visible in the shadows beyond the firelight. One of them came closer, dragging something behind it. Pete's body. It left him just outside, like bait. That's when I made my decision. I grabbed a lantern and the last of my ammunition and told the old man to stay inside. He just nodded like he'd heard it all before. I stepped outside, the cold hitting me like a slap. They were waiting, their heads cocked to one side, like they were curious, like they wanted to see what I'd do. I lit the lantern, smashed it against the cabin wall, and watched as the flames leapt up, catching on the dry wood. I figured if I couldn't get out, I'd take them down with me. The fire spread fast, crackling through the walls, but the creatures didn't flinch. They just watched as the flames consumed the cabin. That's when I realized the old man wasn't just resigned. He was one of them, or something like them, part of whatever lived out there in the woods. I shot at one of the creatures, catching it in the leg. It stumbled, but didn't go down. The others lunged. I fought like hell, but they were faster. One of them grabbed my arm, twisting it until I heard the snap. I dropped to the ground, fighting the pain as I clawed for my rifle, but they knocked it out of reach. Then they stopped. One of them let out a high-pitched yelp, and the others retreated into the shadows as if called back. I lay there, panting, my vision swimming. And then I saw it, their leader, standing on two legs, staring at me with something like curiosity. It leaned down close, sniffing the air, and then it turned and loped off into the trees, dragging Pete's body with it. I don't know why they left me alive. Maybe it was some twisted game. Maybe it was their way of letting me deliver the message. But as I lay there, staring up at the burning cabin, I realized what the old man meant. You don't get out. You just survive. And they let you remember. By dawn, a search party found me. They didn't find the old man, and they sure as hell didn't find Pete. They asked me what happened, but I didn't give them any answers they'd believe. They patched me up, got me out of the woods, and that was that. I left without saying a word. I got out, sure. But sometimes I think about Remy, about Pete, about what those things really are. Part animal, part nightmare. Maybe they were here long before us, just waiting for the woods to change back to the way they liked it. And then I heard the final joke from one of the locals, the one that almost made me laugh. Maybe the woods just didn't like your joke, stranger. My name is Brian Patel, and back in 2021, I embarked on an RV camping trip to the remote stretches of Idaho's Sawtooth National Forest. Ever since I was a kid, I found solace in the great outdoors. It's where I feel most at home, away from the hustle of city life and the constant ping of notifications. I had recently purchased a second-hand RV, a bit rusty around the edges, but still reliable. Friends joked that it had more character than horsepower. I liked it that way. I stocked up on essentials, loaded my mountain bike, and set off with the kind of optimism you get when escaping routine. The drive was tranquil, the kind where the radio fades into the background, and you're left alone with your thoughts. Pine trees blurred past as I navigated winding roads that seemed to lead nowhere and everywhere all at once. About 100 miles into the forest, I found a clearing by a serene lake that looked like a postcard come to life. Setting up camp was straightforward. I parked the RV to face the water, propped open a chair, and cracked open a cold beer. The sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, reflecting off the lake's mirror-like surface. It was the kind of beauty that made you wonder why you didn't do this more often. The first night was uneventful, filled with the comforting sounds of nature. Crickets chirped in a harmonious chorus, while the gentle lapping of water against the shore acted as a lullaby. I fell asleep easily, wrapped in a blanket of stars visible through the RV's skylight. The next morning, I decided to take my bike out for a trail ride. The path was rugged, peppered with roots and rocks that demanded focus, a welcome challenge. About 5 miles in, I noticed something odd, a series of wooden symbols carved into the trees. They were intricate, almost artistic, but gave off an unsettling vibe. One looked like an eye, another like a hand, and others were shapes I couldn't decipher. I shrugged it off as local art or perhaps markers left by hikers. Maybe someone was trying to be the next Banksy of the wilderness. Still, a joke formed in my mind. If a tree gets vandalized in the forest and no one's around to see it, does it lower the property value? As the day wore on, the trail became denser. The canopy overhead thickened, allowing slivers of sunlight to pierce through like spotlights on a dim stage. I was about to turn back when I stumbled upon a dilapidated cabin hidden behind a curtain of ivy and overgrown bushes. Curiosity got the better of me. The cabin looked like it hadn't been inhabited in decades. The windows were shattered, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. Stepping inside, I was hit by a musty odor, a mix of damp wood and something else, something metallic. The interior was sparse, a broken table, a moldy chair, and strange symbols similar to the ones on the trees etched onto the walls. A sense of unease settled in my stomach. Maybe it's time to head back, I thought. But as I turned to leave, my foot caught on something. Looking down, I saw the edge of a rug protruding from under the debris. I pulled it back to reveal a trapdoor. Now, any sensible person might have left right then, but I've been told that my curiosity could be the death of me. Hopefully just a figure of speech. I lifted the trapdoor, revealing a set of wooden stairs descending into darkness. Using the flashlight from my bike kit, I illuminated the passageway. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, the walls worn, with roots protruding like skeletal fingers. At the bottom, the tunnel opened into a larger space, a room lined with shelves filled with jars. As I approached, the contents became horrifyingly clear. Preserved animals, odd specimens floating in formaldehyde, and other things that made my skin crawl. Then I saw them, photographs pinned to a corkboard, images of people, candid shots taken from a distance, hikers, campers, families. My breath caught in my throat when I recognized myself in one of the photos, taken at the lake where I'd set up camp. The caption scribbled below read, "New arrival. Alone." A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. Jokes aside, this was no laughing matter. I had to get out of there. As I turned to leave, a faint sound echoed down the tunnel, the unmistakable creak of the cabin's front door. Panic surged through me. I doused the flashlight and pressed myself against the wall, listening intently. Footsteps moved overhead, slow and deliberate. Whoever it was, they were dragging something heavy. The sound of metal scraping against wood sent a shiver down my spine. I needed an escape route. Scanning the room, I noticed a narrow passage partially hidden behind a shelf. It was a tight squeeze, but it might be my only way out. I squeezed through, the rough walls scraping against my jacket. The passage led upward, curving slightly, until I found myself behind a thicket a few yards from the cabin. Peering through the leaves, I saw him. A tall, gaunt man with unkempt hair and a beard that looked like it hadn't been trimmed in years. He wore a stained flannel shirt and carried an old axe over his shoulder. He dropped a large sack onto the ground with a thud. Something rolled out, a deer carcass. Relief washed over me momentarily, until he pulled out a large hunting knife and began to skin the animal with unsettling precision. There was something methodical, almost ritualistic about his movements. I knew I had to get back to my RV and leave immediately. Keeping low, I moved silently through the underbrush, every snapped twig sounding like a gunshot in my ears. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the trail and mounted my bike, pedaling as fast as I could. The forest, which had seemed so inviting before, now felt like it was closing in on me. Shadows stretched longer, and every rustle of leaves sounded like impending danger. I reached my campsite, adrenaline pumping. Throwing my bike aside, I jumped into the RV and fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I didn't bother securing anything inside. Getting out was the only priority. As I steered onto the narrow road, a figure emerged from the tree line ahead, the same man from the cabin. He stood in the middle of the path, eyes fixed on me. There was no time to stop. I veered off to the side. the RV's tires crunching over rocks and roots. He didn't follow. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw him watching me disappear down the road, a sinister smile creeping across his face. I drove non-stop until I reached the nearest town, a small community called Stanley. Pulling into a gas station, I parked and tried to collect myself. My hands trembled as I dialed the local sheriff's office. An officer named Deputy Harris arrived shortly after. He was a stout man with a firm handshake and a skeptical gaze. I recounted everything: the cabin, the photos, the man. He took notes but maintained a stoic expression. "You're not the first to report something like this," he admitted. "We've had a few hikers go missing over the past decade, but we've never found any concrete evidence." "Well, now you have a location," I insisted. "You have to check it out." He nodded. "We'll look into it. In the meantime, I'd advise you to stay in town until we get this sorted." I agreed, though the idea of spending more time in the area was less than appealing. I checked into a small motel, the kind where the floral wallpaper hasn't changed since the 70s. That night, sleep eluded me. Every creak of the building made me jump. Around midnight, hunger got the better of me, and I decided to visit the all-night diner across the street. The place was nearly empty, except for a waitress and a lone customer seated at the counter. I took a booth by the window and ordered a coffee and a slice of pie. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes, gave me a sympathetic smile. "Rough night?" she asked. "You could say that," I replied. The door chimed as another patron entered. Glancing up, my heart skipped a beat. It was the man from the cabin. He looked different, cleaner somehow, dressed in a plaid shirt and jeans. He walked in casually and took a seat at the counter, 2 stools away from the other customer. Was it really him? Or was my mind playing tricks on me? I couldn't be sure. I decided to play it cool and not draw attention to myself. The waitress greeted him warmly. "Evening, Caleb. The usual?" He nodded. "Thanks, Margie." Caleb. That was his name. He seemed familiar to her. A regular, maybe? I was mistaken, perhaps. Just a case of small-town residents bearing a resemblance to one another. I overheard snippets of their conversation. "How's the farm?" Margie asked. "Can't complain. Harvest season's been kind to us," he replied. I felt a wave of relief. This man seemed normal, friendly even. Maybe the stress was getting to me, causing me to see threats where there were none. Just then, the other customer at the counter stood up to leave. As he turned, I caught his face, a rugged-looking fellow with a scar running down his cheek. He gave me a nod and exited the diner. Caleb watched him leave, his friendly demeanor slipping ever so slightly. His gaze then shifted, locking eyes with me. A sly grin formed on his lips. "You're not from around here, are you?" he called out. I swallowed hard. "Just passing through," I answered. He picked up his coffee mug and walked over to my booth. "Mind if I join you?" Actually, I did mind, but I couldn't think of a polite way to refuse. "Sure," I said, forcing a smile. He slid into the seat across from me. Up close, I could see a small tattoo peeking out from under his sleeve, a series of symbols similar to those I'd seen carved into the trees and cabin walls. "Name's Caleb," he offered, extending his hand. "Brian," I replied, shaking it. "Unusual name. What's got you visiting our little corner of the world?" "Just some RV camping. Needed a break from city life." He nodded slowly. "The forest can be a peaceful place, or not, depending on where you wander." There was an edge to his voice now. The friendly facade was fading. "Yeah, had a bit of a scare earlier," I admitted, hoping honesty might diffuse whatever this was. "Came across an old cabin. Thought I saw something strange." "Strange things have a way of finding strangers," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. Margie interrupted by bringing over his meal, a bowl of chili and a slice of cornbread. "Here you go, hun." "Thanks," he replied, but his focus remained on me. I decided to test the waters. "You ever hear stories about that area? Maybe about people going missing?" He took a slow sip of his coffee. "Can't say I have, but then again, folks around here tend to mind their own business." Silence hung between us. I felt an urgent need to leave. "Well, it's getting late. I should probably head back." He smiled. "Of course. Don't let me keep you. I left a few bills on the table and stood up. As I turned to go, he spoke again. Be careful out there, Thaddeus. The woods aren't always as empty as they seem. I hurried back to the motel, every instinct telling me to get out of town immediately. Back in my room, I packed my belongings and decided to drive through the night. As I exited the motel, I noticed a piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. Unfolding it, I saw it was one of the photographs from the cabin. This one of me, sitting by the lake, circled in red ink. Panic surged anew. I jumped into the RV and sped off, not caring about speed limits or the noise of the engine. In the rearview mirror, I thought I saw headlights turn on and follow, but I couldn't be sure. After hours of driving, I crossed state lines and didn't stop until I reached a large town with plenty of people around. A few days later, I contacted the state police, providing them with all the information I had. They took my statement seriously and assured me they'd investigate. Weeks went by, and I received a call from a detective, Monroe. We searched the area you mentioned, he said. Found the cabin and the underground room. Did you find anything? I asked. Place was cleared out. No jars, no photographs, just an empty space. What about the man? Caleb? Local records show no one by that name matching your description. The diner you mentioned burned down last year. Margie, the waitress, died in the fire. A cold realization settled in. None of it made sense. Determined to find answers, I did some digging of my own. Online forums, local newspaper archives, anything that could shed light on what I'd experienced. I stumbled upon an old article from 1995 about a man named Caleb Foster, a farmer who was suspected of multiple disappearances but was never charged. He died in a car crash 2 decades ago, but that was impossible. I'd met him, or someone pretending to be him. To this day, I don't know who or what I encountered in that small Idaho town. But I do know one thing. Some roads are better left untraveled. It was in 2008, somewhere in the middle of Montana, right near the edge of a national forest no one really bothered to visit. That was the point, though, wasn't it? A place no one paid attention to. My name is Austin Gibson. Yeah, I know. Sounds like a TV detective. But that's where the comparisons end. I wasn't chasing down bad guys in an old convertible. I was a grunt on a mission that wasn't supposed to be written down anywhere. They gave us vague orders: survey a part of the forest, collect data, watch for unusual activity, whatever that meant. Sounded more like a field trip than a military op, and we sure as hell weren't in uniform for this one. The forest was dense, trees twisted and grown wild like the land had a mind of its own. No trails, no clearings, just miles of green swallowing the sky. And when you're deep in a place like that, with the crunch of dead leaves underfoot and shadows creeping in from every angle, you get that prickling feeling, like you're walking into something's living room uninvited. We were a team of 4, all of us in civilian gear. James Chen, a guy with a background in tracking. Think of him as a walking encyclopedia for animal signs. Mario Costa, our medic, always had a dirty joke ready, usually about our moms. And Jan Walsh, the kind of guy who kept to himself but had the best poker face I'd ever seen. You never knew if he was joking or being serious, made him real annoying on a long mission. But he was solid when things went sideways. We set up camp about 12 clicks from the last known logging road in a clearing that barely qualified as one. No fire. Command had warned against it. Night came down fast, the kind that wraps around you and hides everything more than 5 feet away. Chen started in about mountain lions and grizzlies, like we needed reminding. Walsh cut in with a story about a guy he knew who'd been mauled. And then Costa, true to form, made some crack about how none of us would last a day on a dating app. The usual stuff to keep things light. Around midnight, we heard it. A sound that didn't fit. Not the wind, not a branch breaking, but something dragging itself over rocks, like nails scraping against gravel. Chen's head snapped up, his hand already on the rifle we weren't supposed to use unless absolutely necessary. We went quiet, listening, letting the forest swallow us. Walsh motioned forward, and we followed him in a staggered line, creeping through the underbrush. The noise led us to a narrow ravine about 100 yards from our camp. That's where we found the first body. A deer, but not any kind of kill I'd seen before. Its ribs had been pulled apart like someone tried to crack open a walnut and then gave up halfway. But it wasn't just that. Something had gnawed through its spine. Chen crouched over it, poking around with a stick. He muttered something about no tracks, no claw marks, but his voice shook a bit, like he didn't believe his own assessment. We turned back, leaving the carcass, figuring it was just a fluke, a one-off. That assumption didn't last. Not when we found the second one. This time, a fox, gutted and left tangled in the roots of a tree. And not when Costa stumbled upon the third. Something with too much blood for a small animal, splattered across the rocks like someone took a paint can to it. By the third day, we weren't talking much. We knew better than to spook each other. But hell, it's hard to stay calm when every other step you take, you feel like there's someone breathing down your neck. But still, we had orders. Collect the data, watch for anything odd, report back. Except there was no radio signal out there. So we were on our own until we made it back to the rendezvous point. That night, Costa disappeared. 1 minute, he was next to me, making some joke about the lack of cell service, and then he wasn't. We assumed he'd gone to take a leak. No one thought much of it, until 20 minutes passed, then 30. I called out. Walsh too. Nothing. We grabbed flashlights and fanned out. I found his rifle just lying there against a tree, but no sign of him, no sound. It wasn't like Costa to just wander off. He wasn't the adventurous type. We spent the next few hours searching, but all we found was a smudge of blood on a tree trunk. Not enough to mean anything definite. Just a smear, like he'd cut his hand and touched the bark. Chen said maybe he fell into the ravine, broke something. But we checked there, and there wasn't a trace of him. That's when the dread settled in, thick and heavy. The next morning, we heard a scream. I've heard men scream before in combat when a bullet catches them in a bad spot. This wasn't like that. It came from the east, somewhere deep in the woods. We all froze, listening. Chen's face went pale. He muttered that it wasn't Costa, that it didn't sound like him. We moved toward the sound, rifles raised, hearts pounding like we were back in a firefight. We found Costa, all right, or what was left of him. His body lay face down, half submerged in a shallow stream, the back of his skull missing. But that wasn't what got to me. It was the way his limbs were twisted, like something had tried to pull him apart but hadn't finished the job. Chen lost it, started cursing, pacing back and forth, saying it didn't make sense. Kept repeating that there should have been tracks, but there was nothing. Just drag marks in the dirt that led into the thick trees. Walsh pointed out that Costa's sidearm was missing. That's when it hit us. He'd tried to fight back. Whatever took him, he'd put up a struggle. But it didn't matter. We should have left right then. Forget the mission. Forget the orders. Just hike out and get to the nearest town. But there's a kind of pride that keeps you from doing the smart thing. Maybe it was the training. Maybe it was that unspoken rule that you don't leave a man behind. So we stayed. We buried what was left of Costa under some rocks and pushed further into the forest, following those drag marks. Around noon, we found an old cabin, or what was left of it. Just some rotted wood and a chimney that leaned like it was tired of standing up. Chen went inside, looking for signs of life, but all he found was dust and an old bear trap, rusted shut. We were about to leave when I noticed something carved into the wood near the door. Symbols, almost like the kind you'd find in some backwoods superstition. Not that I believed in that stuff, but they looked fresh, like someone had scratched them in not too long ago. Walsh said we should keep moving, but I could tell he was just as spooked as the rest of us. As we stepped away, I caught a glimpse of something in the trees, a shadow that didn't quite fit, a shape that seemed to shift, then vanish when I blinked. Chen saw it too, and we shared a look. No one said anything. What was the point? We'd all seen it. We'd all seen too much already. No one said anything. What was the point? We'd all seen it. We'd all seen too much already. That night, we set up a perimeter, flashlights, and a few makeshift traps. But it was a joke, really. Whatever took Costa wasn't going to trip over some wire and cans. We stayed awake in shifts, but sleep wouldn't have come anyway. Not with that feeling creeping over us like we were being studied. When it came to my turn, I sat with my back against a tree, rifle across my lap, scanning the darkness. That's when I saw it again, just outside the circle of light. Something hunched and wrong. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a cougar. It moved like a deer, but with limbs too long, like it didn't know how they were supposed to bend. It stepped forward just enough for me to catch a glimpse of its face, or what I thought was a face. Too smooth, too human in a way that twisted your gut. I froze, finger on the trigger, but before I could take a shot, it bolted, silent as a whisper, back into the trees. I thought I imagined it. But then, I heard the crash of branches behind me, Chen stumbling out of his position, his face pale. He'd seen it too. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked, and he just shook his head. It came for us before dawn. A shriek cut through the air, and suddenly Walsh was gone. 1 second, he was beside me. The next, there was a smear of blood across the dirt where he'd been standing. Chen and I fired into the dark, not aiming, just shooting, hoping it would scare off whatever the hell was out there. For a second, I thought it worked. But then I heard a crunch behind me. I spun around, flashlight sweeping across the ground, and there it was, dragging Walsh into the underbrush. I fired, the recoil slamming into my shoulder, and the thing dropped Walsh. But it didn't run. It just turned, twisted its neck to look at me. And I'll never forget that. The way it stared, like it was trying to decide if I was worth the effort. Chen charged it, knife in hand. He'd run out of bullets. It swiped at him, sent him sprawling into the dirt, but he got a good slice in, tore open its side. Something spilled out of it. Not quite blood. Not quite anything I could identify. It let out a sound like an animal in pain, but worse. I grabbed Chen, and we ran. Left everything behind. Gear, supplies, Costa's grave. We didn't stop, didn't look back. We reached the edge of the forest just as the sun was coming up. My lungs burned, my legs felt like lead, but I didn't care. I kept dragging Chen along until we finally reached the nearest logging road. A beat-up truck was parked there, some old guy with a shotgun leaning against the hood. He looked at us, then at the blood on our clothes, and just nodded, like he'd seen it all before. He drove us to a town without asking questions. We didn't offer any answers. They called it a cougar attack when we reported it. Didn't even bother searching for Walsh or Costa. Just shrugged and said, "That's the way it goes out here." But I knew better, and so did Chen. Though he never talked about it again. Didn't even stay in touch. Last I heard, he moved down south. Said he needed to be somewhere flat, somewhere open. I went back to that forest once, years later, just to see if there was anything left of the cabin or the symbols on the door. But the place was gone, like it had never been there in the first place. No signs, no ruins, just trees and silence. But every so often, I hear about another missing hiker, another body found, torn open like a fruit. Maybe it's moved on, maybe it hasn't. But whatever it is, it's out there, and it's not done yet. Something that knows we're not supposed to be in its woods. And one of these days, someone's going to find out what it really is. Maybe they'll be luckier than we were, or maybe not. My name's Jeremy Harris, and this happened back in 1999 in the thick pine stretches of Idaho's Payette National Forest. Now, I'm not some storytelling type, but when you've seen what I've seen, it sits with you whether you want it to or not. I've been with the Forest Service for nearly a decade, mostly search and rescue, but I don't really get a thrill out of finding folks lost off the trails. It's just a job, pays the bills and keeps my folks from worrying too much. But this wasn't a typical day at work. The call came in just past noon. 2 teenagers had gone missing around Lake Cascade while hiking, and their mom swore up and down that they wouldn't have wandered off the marked trails. Typical, I thought. Parents always claim their kids aren't the type to take risks, and they end up climbing a cliffside or venturing miles off the paths. I radioed in, grabbed my pack, and met up with my buddy Matt Taylor at the ranger station. We'd handled plenty of search missions together, so we had our system down pat. By the time we started the hike, the sun was a half-hearted glow behind thick clouds, casting a dim grayness over the woods. We headed up the main trail, our boots crunching over the underbrush and fallen pine needles. I remember making some wisecrack about the kids probably sitting by the lake with no cell signal, blissfully unaware of the mini panic they'd sparked. Matt chuckled and responded with something about making up for our overtime with the stash of cold beers back at the station. Just another day on the job, or so I thought. It wasn't long before we hit signs of trouble. About a mile up, we found what looked like a small campsite, scattered granola bar wrappers, a disposable camera, and a dirty sweatshirt lying next to a patch of trampled ferns. But something was off about the setup. It didn't feel like kids were lounging around here. It felt more like someone had run through. The air was heavy, and I could smell this rank, earthy stench that was wrong for the forest. Matt raised an eyebrow at me, like he was feeling it too. We called out a few times, half expecting the teens to stumble out of the bushes, embarrassed and red-faced. But nothing stirred except a few startled birds. That eerie silence filled the gaps where sound should be. I knelt down, trying to get a sense of what had gone down here. There was a sharp imprint in the dirt, something like a claw mark, but wider and deeper than any animal I'd seen in these woods. I brushed my fingers over it, feeling the jagged lines. Whatever made that wasn't anything natural. You seeing this? Jeremy Harris had spotted something farther up, a chunk of what looked like torn fabric caught on a low-hanging branch. It was a piece of a t-shirt, stained dark, likely blood. A chill settled over me then, the realization sinking in. Whatever was out here wasn't just a wild animal. We both knew when to trust our gut, and mine was screaming that we were in over our heads. We pressed on, calling their names, but now every rustle in the bushes had me glancing over my shoulder. About a mile deeper into the woods, we found the first body. It was one of the teens, a boy, face down with his arm twisted under him at an unnatural angle. His body was mangled in a way that no mountain lion or bear would have done. His torso was scratched open, not by claws but by something else, something that seemed to tear rather than slash. Matt stepped back, a grimace on his face, muttering something I didn't quite catch. We checked for signs of life, even though it was obvious we'd be wasting our time. He was gone. Worse yet, the terror etched onto his face told us this was no accident, no animal mishap. It was a hunt. We radioed back to the station, giving as calm a report as we could manage. They told us to stay put, that backup was on the way, but Matt and I exchanged a look. Sitting still in the woods with God knows what lurking around? Not likely. We agreed to find higher ground and keep watch until help arrived. But something told me that wouldn't be enough. Just as we started back toward a nearby ridge, we heard a faint sound, a low, uneven clicking, like stones scraping together. It was rhythmic and unnatural, like it had intent behind it. Matt raised his flashlight, sweeping it in a wide arc. I followed his beam, and for a moment we saw nothing but trees and shadows. Then, between two thick pines, a shape appeared. It was unlike anything I'd seen, like a mix between a lizard and something much larger. It moved low to the ground with a long, scaly body and limbs that looked almost human in shape, though bent and twisted in a way no human could ever walk. Its skin was dark and rough, patched with what looked like scales. But the strangest part was its head. Elongated, with a wide, flat mouth and jagged rows of what I can only describe as crocodile-like teeth. Matt and I froze. The thing paused, raising its head as if it sensed us. Then, with a sharp hiss, it lunged forward. I didn't have time to think. My instincts took over, and I yanked Matt to the side just as it shot past us, swiping the air with a clawed arm. We bolted up the ridge, tripping over roots and rocks in our haste. But it was on us, relentless, snapping its jaws and thrashing through the underbrush with every step. I remember yelling at Matt to split off, hoping to confuse it, or at least buy us some time. He hesitated, but the look on my face must have convinced him, and he veered off to the left. I dove to the right, dodging trees and scrambling up a small incline. Behind me, I could hear it crashing through the forest, tearing at anything in its path. There was no mercy, no pause. It was like it had locked onto us, hungry and unyielding. I lost track of Matt in the chaos, my mind racing as I looked for any place to hide. I spotted a small crevice between two rocks and dove in, pressing myself flat against the earth, hoping it would lose my scent. But then I heard the unmistakable sound of Matt's scream, cutting through the forest. It was short, choked off, and I knew he'd met the same fate as the teenager back at the campsite. The clicking sound grew fainter, and I dared to lift my head. My legs were numb, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. But the forest around me was silent again. I stayed hidden for what felt like hours, watching the trees, waiting for any sign of movement. When I was sure it was safe, I crawled out, my legs unsteady, and started the long trek back to the station, alone. When I returned to the ranger station, the backup was just arriving. They looked at me like I'd gone mad when I tried to explain what happened. They asked about Matt, and I told them the truth, as much as they would believe. We went back out to search, but we only found remnants, torn pieces of clothing, broken branches, drag marks leading deeper into the forest. No sign of Matt, no bodies. Nothing to prove what we'd seen, except my own word. Months later, I did some digging, trying to find any hint of what that creature was. Local legends spoke of a predator, something that roamed these woods centuries ago, rumored to be a guardian or a curse, depending on who you asked. They called it the El Cal, a name whispered by those who claimed to have seen it before vanishing into the wilderness. They said it only showed itself to those who dared to encroach on its territory, too far, too boldly, as if it needed to remind us that we were still trespassers here. That creature, it wasn't just hunting, it was sending a message, loud and clear. The road into the Boundary Waters was a frozen ribbon through a sea of snow, the trees standing like silent sentinels under heavy blankets of ice. The RV's heater hummed steadily, but even that couldn't keep the biting cold out. I was deep into the wilderness now, the place I'd picked to spend a week, just me, the frozen lake, and the stillness of winter. I'd been coming to places like this for years, ever since the accident. The solitude was the only thing that seemed to quiet my mind. This time, I was here to ice fish, maybe snap a few photos for my nature blog, but mostly I was here to prove to myself that I could still handle it. The cold, the isolation, the memories. I pulled the RV to a stop by a small frozen lake I'd scouted on a map. It was miles away from the nearest town, completely off the grid, just how I liked it. I stepped out into the icy air, my breath fogging in front of me as I took in the sight. The lake was a vast white expanse, the ice thick enough to drive on, stretching out into the distance where the trees disappeared into a blur of white. Perfect. I set up camp quickly, parking the RV near the shoreline and gathering my gear for ice fishing. The cold had a way of creeping into your bones out here, but I didn't mind. I was used to it. I grabbed my auger, trudged out onto the ice, and started drilling a hole. The sound of the blade biting into the ice echoed through the stillness, sharp and harsh against the quiet of the wilderness. Then I heard it, a deep, low rumble that seemed to come from beneath the ice. I paused, the auger still in my hands, and listened. The sound came again, a low, distant vibration like the ice shifting far beneath the surface. I'd heard ice groan before. Anyone who spends enough time in the cold knows the sound of a lake adjusting to the freeze, but this was different. It was deeper, longer, almost like something was moving down there. I brushed it off and kept drilling. By the time the hole was ready, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow. I set up my fishing gear, lowered the line into the icy water, and settled in to wait. The cold crept in quickly, even through my heavy coat, but I was prepared for it. I'd done this 100 times before, and the routine was comforting. But that sound, the rumble beneath the ice, kept creeping back into my thoughts. As night fell, I lit a small fire near the shore, the flames flickering weakly against the chill. I sat by the fire, staring out at the frozen expanse of the lake. The stars were starting to appear in the clear sky above, bright and distant. Then I saw it. a light, faintly flickering and coming from beneath the ice. At first, I thought it was a reflection, maybe the moonlight hitting the ice in just the right way. But as I watched, the light moved slow and steady, as if something was drifting beneath the surface. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but it was still there, faint and regular, like a lantern swaying beneath the ice. I stood, my heart pounding in my chest, and walked toward the lake. The light seemed to pulse, growing brighter for a moment, then dimming again, always moving, always just out of reach. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a trick of the light or a reflection of something from the sky. But deep down, I knew better. There was no one else out here, no one who could be moving under the ice. The rumble came again, louder this time, vibrating up through the soles of my boots. I took a step back, suddenly feeling exposed out there on the open ice. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and I turned back toward the RV, my mind racing. The light, the sound. Something wasn't right. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I went back out onto the lake, determined to make sense of it all. The sun was barely up, and the cold was more biting than ever. As I walked, I glanced back toward the hole I drilled the day before. Something was off. There, by the edge of the hole, was a long, jagged crack running across the ice. The crack hadn't been there yesterday. It snaked out in a jagged line, as if something had pressed up from below. I knelt down, running my gloved fingers along the crack, feeling the cold seeping through the ice. The surface felt thin, too thin for the middle of winter. Then I noticed something glinting just beneath the ice. I leaned closer, peering into the crack. At first, it looked like a piece of metal, rusted and sharp, lodged beneath the surface. I reached into the cold water, pulling it free. It was old, jagged, like part of a machine, but there was no reason for it to be here. The nearest road was miles away, and there hadn't been any mining or construction in the area for years. The metal was strange, sharp and smooth, like it had been cut clean. As I held the piece in my hand, the rumbling came again, louder now, closer. I stood quickly, scanning the lake. The light was back, faint but steady, moving beneath the ice, closer than before. My pulse quickened, and I felt a cold sweat break out under my coat. Something was down there. Something was moving. I backed away from the crack, my mind racing. The metal, the light, the sound, it all pointed to something beneath the ice. Something unnatural. But what? The stories I had heard over the years about strange things beneath the frozen lakes, about disappearances and creatures buried deep in the ice, came flooding back. I'd always dismissed them as nonsense, campfire stories to scare the newcomers. But now, standing there in the middle of the frozen lake, I wasn't so sure. I needed answers. Later that day, as I was gathering more firewood, I came across an old ice fishing shack near the edge of the lake that looked abandoned. But there were fresh footprints in the snow leading up to the door. Curious, I approached, knocking lightly before pushing the door open. Inside, I found an older man hunched over a small stove, warming his hands. His face was weathered, his beard streaked with gray, and he looked up at me with tired eyes as I stepped in. "Didn't expect to see anyone out here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The man grunted, his eyes narrowing. "Not many come this deep into the wilderness." I hesitated. "I've been hearing strange sounds under the ice, and I saw a light last night, moving beneath the surface. Do you know anything about that?" The man's expression darkened. He turned back to the stove, staring into the flames. "You shouldn't be out on that lake," he said quietly. "There are things beneath the ice, things that shouldn't be disturbed." "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart pounding. The man sighed, rubbing a hand across his face. "There's an old mining operation under that lake, abandoned long ago. They were digging deep, too deep. Some say they woke something up down there. Ever since, strange things have happened. People go missing. The ice breaks when it shouldn't. And that light, it's not the only thing that moves down there." A chill ran down my spine. "What's under there?" The man shook his head. "I don't know. But I've been coming out here for years, and I've seen enough to know when something isn't right. The lake's alive. It's watching you." That night, the light beneath the ice returned, brighter than before, pulsing like a heartbeat. I watched from the RV, my breath fogging up the window, as the rumbling beneath the ice grew louder, more insistent. I knew I couldn't stay. Whatever was beneath the lake, it was waking up. I packed my gear quickly, throwing everything into the RV. But as I started the engine, the ground beneath the RV began to tremble. The rumbling was almost deafening now, vibrating up through the frozen earth. I glanced out toward the lake, and my blood ran cold. The ice was cracking, long fissures spreading out from the center of the lake. And then, in the distance, the surface of the ice exploded upward, a massive shape breaking through. I only caught a glimpse, something dark and enormous, sliding beneath the ice again, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. But it was enough. I floored the gas pedal, the RV lurching forward as I raced away from the lake, the sound of cracking ice echoing behind me. The road was a blur, my heart pounding in my chest. But even as I drove, I could still feel it, the weight of something massive beneath the surface, watching, waiting. When I finally reached the main road, the rumbling stopped. But the memory of that thing beneath the ice stayed with me. I'll never forget it. The way the light pulsed, the way the ice cracked as if it were alive. I left the boundary waters behind, but a part of me knows I'll never truly escape it. Some things should stay buried. And whatever's beneath that lake, it's not finished yet. The fog was thicker than I'd expected. I pulled my RV into a secluded clearing in Pisgah National Forest and stepped out into the damp air, the smell of wet earth heavy in my nose. Everything was muffled, as if the forest was holding its breath. The trees were shrouded in mist, their trunks fading into the gloom, and the trail I'd heard so much about was hidden somewhere out there, waiting for me. I'd come here to find something unique. My vlog had been stagnating, and I needed a fresh angle. A fellow hiker had mentioned an unmarked trail, a path that didn't appear on any maps. One locals swore disappeared and reappeared as if it had a life of its own. Perfect. If I could document it, film the mystery, my audience would eat it up. I grabbed my camera, set it up, and filmed a quick introduction. Hey everyone, it's Nate here, and I'm in the middle of the misty Pisgah National Forest, about to track down the infamous Vanishing Trail. Legend says this path comes and goes, and people who wander too far down it don't come back. Let's see if that's true. I packed up my gear and set off into the fog. The forest was silent, the only sound my boots crunching on damp leaves. I had a GPS in my pocket just in case, but I didn't plan to use it unless things got really bad. I wanted to go off the grid, find this mysterious trail, and see if there was anything to the rumors. I'd always been a skeptic. Ghost stories and folklore are fun to tell around a campfire, but not much else. As I walked, the fog thickened, swallowing the trees. It clung to my skin, cold and heavy. It wasn't long before I found the first strange marker, a stone slab jutting from the ground, its surface covered in spiraling symbols that didn't look like any language I knew. I filmed it, talking into the camera as I described the find. This looks like something from an old burial ground, but there's no mention of this on any maps. Really makes you wonder what else is out here, hidden beneath the fog. I kept moving. The trees closed in tighter, and the trail became fainter, more overgrown. Soon, it was little more than a game trail, barely wide enough to follow. I pushed forward, keeping the camera rolling, but after another hour of hiking, the trail simply disappeared. One moment, there had been a clear path. Now it was gone, swallowed by the forest. I checked my GPS, but the signal flickered weakly. The screen showed I was in the middle of nowhere. No path, no landmarks, just a blank screen with a blinking dot. Me, alone, in the fog. Okay, I muttered, you've dealt with worse. I turned back the way I'd come, but the forest looked different now. The trees seemed closer together, the undergrowth denser. The fog was disorienting, and I had to rely on instinct to retrace my steps. The GPS was useless. I kept walking, scanning the ground for signs of the trail, but there was nothing. I was starting to feel uneasy. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, not mine. I froze. The sound came from deeper in the forest, slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on the leaves. I turned, scanning the fog, but there was nothing, just the swirling mist. Then out of the gloom, a figure emerged. An older man, his clothes tattered and damp, his eyes wide and vacant. Hey, I called, my voice echoing through the stillness. You lost too? The man looked at me for a moment, then shuffled forward. He seemed off. His clothes were torn, his face pale, and there was a distant look in his eyes, like he wasn't entirely there. I've been walking for days, he said, his voice hoarse. The trail. It keeps changing. Are you okay? I asked, stepping toward him. He shook his head. No one's okay out here. I frowned, feeling a cold knot of fear tighten in my stomach. What do you mean? The trail. It moves. I've seen it, watched it disappear and reappear. It's not just a path. It's the forest. It doesn't want us to leave. I stared at him, my mind racing. This guy was either delirious or onto something. Either way, I didn't like the way he was talking. Look, I have a GPS, I said, pulling it out. We can find our way back. The man glanced at the GPS, then back at me. It won't help. The forest is messing with it. I didn't believe him. I couldn't. I was a rational guy, and this was just a forest. I'd get us back to my RV, get this guy some help, and be done with it. But as we walked, things got stranger. The mist thickened, wrapping around the trees like a living thing. The forest seemed to shift with every step. What had been an open path a moment ago would be choked with brambles. When I looked back, trees seemed to loom closer, twisting into unfamiliar shapes. The man, whose name I learned was Eli, grew more agitated with every passing minute. It's watching us, he muttered. It knows we're here. Who's watching? I asked, growing impatient. The forest, he said, his voice barely a whisper. It's alive, and it's been here long before we were. I ignored him, focusing on the GPS, but even that was failing me. The screen flickered, the signal cutting in and out. At one point, it showed me standing on a clear path, but when I looked up, there was nothing but trees. Thick, twisted trees that looked like they had grown there for centuries. We kept walking, the fog growing thicker, pressing in on us. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and the whispers started. Faint at first, like the wind through the leaves, but then more distinct voices calling out from the mist. Nate? I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Did you hear that? I asked Eli. He nodded, his eyes wide. It's calling us. The forest. I tried to shake it off, tell myself it was just the wind, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. The voice had spoken my name. We came across a backpack tangled in the branches of a tree, high above our heads. It was old, covered in dirt and torn, but when I climbed up to retrieve it, I found fresh supplies inside, water, food, like someone had packed it yesterday. I felt a chill run down my spine. How had it gotten there? Eli was growing more paranoid, his eyes darting around like he expected the trees to come alive at any moment. We need to leave, he kept saying, before it's too late. We pushed forward, but no matter which direction we went, we ended up back where we started. The fog seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The whispers grew louder. Then, without warning, Eli was gone. I turned around, and he was just gone. The forest had swallowed him whole without a sound. I called out his name, but there was no response, only the dense mist pressing in on me. Panic set in. I was alone, lost in a forest that didn't want me to leave. The GPS was useless, and my camera was flickering, showing distorted footage of things I hadn't seen. Shadows moving in the trees, figures lurking just out of sight. I started running, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The trees twisted and shifted around me. The fog was so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. Every time I thought I'd found a way out, the forest closed in, trapping me in a maze of branches and brambles. The whispers were louder now, calling my name over and over. My camera caught glimpses of movement, dark figures moving through the mist, vanishing before I could focus on them. I didn't know what was real anymore. The forest seemed to warp around me, bending reality to its will. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the fog broke. I stumbled out of the trees and found myself back at my RV. The mist lingered at the edge of the forest, but it didn't follow. I didn't wait. I grabbed my keys, threw my gear into the RV, and drove, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the forest a distant memory in the rearview mirror. Back home, I reviewed the footage. I expected to see the horror I'd witnessed, the proof of the vanishing trail and the strange shifting forest. But the videos showed nothing. The trail looked normal, the mist wasn't as thick, and Eli wasn't in the footage at all. It was like he'd never existed. I tried to tell myself it had been a bad trip, that my mind had played tricks on me. But deep down, I knew the truth. The forest had let me leave, but it hadn't forgotten me, and I had a feeling it was waiting somewhere in the mist for me to return. The forest around me was too quiet. I'd been sitting by the campfire outside my RV, immersed in the silence for hours, but now something felt off. The kind of off you feel in your gut before your brain catches up to what's happening. No wind, no rustling in the leaves, just dead stillness. That was the first thing I noticed when I pulled up to this remote campsite deep in Mount Hood National Forest. A place like this should have been full of life, birds, insects, something. But the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the distant hum of the radio I'd brought along. I needed quiet after everything that had happened over the past year. I wasn't looking for distractions, just isolation. After my wife's death, nothing made sense anymore. People kept telling me I needed to move on, but the noise of life, the sympathy, the well-meaning advice, the friends who didn't know what to say, became unbearable. So I packed up and hit the road, hoping the wilderness would give me space to think, or maybe stop thinking altogether. I thought the forest would help. It had, until now. The radio's static broke the silence, a sudden burst of garbled noise that made me jump. I turned my head toward the RV, where the old ham radio sat inside. I hadn't even touched the thing in hours. It was an antique I'd brought along to mess around with in my downtime, but the signal had been dead all day. No stations, no chatter, nothing. Until now. I stood up from the fire, walked over to the RV, and ducked inside to check the radio. The static was louder, more insistent, like it was trying to form words but couldn't quite get there. I twisted the dials, searching for a clearer signal, but all I got was more white noise. Then, through the crackling, I heard it. A voice, faint and garbled, speaking numbers. 1, 3, 7, 8, 9. The numbers repeated over and over, mechanical and cold, like a voice from an old number station. It didn't make sense. I was miles from anywhere, and this was supposed to be a dead zone. No signal, no interference. The voice paused for a moment, then the numbers started again. 1, 3, 7. It sent a chill through me, but I told myself it was just some rogue signal bouncing off the atmosphere. Maybe a military transmission. There were logical explanations for this kind of thing. I was sure of it, but the way the numbers repeated over and over felt wrong. Like the message wasn't for just anyone, it was for me. I shut the radio off. My fingers were trembling slightly. I wasn't here for this. I needed quiet, not some weird radio signal rattling around in my head. The next day, I tried to forget about the radio. I spent the morning hiking through the woods. The towering pines loomed overhead like silent giants. The air was cool and damp, the sky just a sliver of gray through the dense canopy. But something gnawed at me, a faint buzzing at the back of my mind. No birds, no animals, just silence. When I returned to the campsite, the radio was on again, static blaring from the speakers. I hadn't touched it. I stepped inside the RV, staring at the radio like it might come to life. The static was louder now, more intense. I could feel it in my bones, like the vibration from a low hum in the ground. And beneath the static, the numbers were back. 1, 3, 7, 8. I slammed my hand down on the off switch, killing the sound. My pulse was racing, my mind scrambling for an explanation. It had to be a glitch, something with the wiring, maybe a stray electrical signal. I'd worked with enough technology over the years to know that things sometimes did strange things when you weren't looking. But the numbers, the way they were so clear, so deliberate, I shook it off and stepped back outside, trying to push the growing unease away. That's when I noticed the man standing at the edge of my campsite. I hadn't heard him approach. He was just there, tall, scruffy, wearing a weathered jacket and a backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked like a camper, but there was something about the way he stood, stiff and tense, like he was waiting for something to happen. "Hey!" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "You lost?" The man looked at me, his face tight with anxiety. "I heard it too," he said. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. "Heard what?" "The signal, the numbers," he said, glancing toward the RV. "I've been picking it up on my own radio. It's not normal." My mouth went dry. "You've heard it too?" The man nodded. "I'm Ben," he said, stepping closer, his voice low. "I was camping a few miles down the road. I've been getting static, voices, weird electrical interference. My GPS stopped working. My cell phone drained to zero in minutes." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. "What do you think it is?" Ben shook his head, his eyes darting toward the trees. "I don't know, but it's not natural. The way the signal moves, it's like it's getting closer." I didn't know how to respond to that. I was a man of logic, of science. Signals were signals, glitches were glitches. But there was something about the way Ben spoke, the fear in his eyes, that made my skin crawl. That night, the radio came to life again. I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the campfire and the peaceful silence of the woods, but the static was louder than before. The numbers were clearer, more insistent. 1, 3, 7, 8. Ben was sitting across from me, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. His eyes constantly scanned the dark forest around us. He hadn't relaxed since he showed up, and I couldn't blame him. There was something wrong here, something I couldn't explain. "You think it's some kind of broadcast?" I asked, more to fill the silence than anything. Ben shook his head. "I don't think it's a broadcast at all." "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I think it's a warning, or a signal from something out there." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. A warning from what? Before I could ask, the static on the radio cut out for a moment. There was only silence, the kind of silence that presses down on you, that makes your skin prickle with anticipation. Then a sound, a soft, rhythmic clicking, like something metallic tapping against wood. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the trees, but the beam only revealed darkness. The clicking grew louder, echoing through the forest. And then, through the radio, a voice crackled to life. "We see you." My blood ran cold. Ben's eyes widened, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The voice repeated, distorted and mechanical. "We see you." I stood up, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The clicking sound was closer now, coming from all around us, moving through the trees. The forest seemed to pulse with energy, the air growing thick and heavy, like the atmosphere itself was alive. "I think we should leave," Ben said, his voice tight with fear. For once, I agreed. The next morning, I found Ben's tent abandoned. His gear was scattered around the clearing, but there was no sign of him, no footprints, no note. Just the cold, empty forest and the low hum of static that had settled into the air like a living thing. I tried to follow his tracks, but they vanished in the thick underbrush. It was like he'd walked into the trees and disappeared. The GPS on my phone was useless, spinning me in circles. The battery drained faster than I'd ever seen. The static in my ears grew louder the further I went, like the signal was inside my head, vibrating through my skull. The numbers were back too, repeating over and over, etched into my mind. 1, 3, 7. By midday, I stumbled across something I hadn't expected, an old dilapidated radio tower hidden deep in the woods. The metal was rusted, vines crawling up the sides, but it was still faintly humming with power. I climbed the tower, Tess every step echoing in the stillness. My heart hammered in my chest. At the top, I found the source of the signal, a small, glowing device pulsing with an eerie cold light. It didn't belong here. It wasn't part of the original tower. It was something else, something foreign. I reached out and touched it, and the static in my head exploded. The numbers, the clicking, the voices, it all crashed into me at once, an unbearable cacophony of sound. I stumbled back, nearly falling off the tower as the forest seemed to come alive around me. The lights returned, flickering in the trees, cold and mechanical. The clicking grew louder, more frantic, like something was chasing me. I ran. I don't remember how I made it back to the RV, but the lights followed me, the clicking never far behind. But I managed to get inside and slam the door shut. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, the device still clutched in my hand. As I drove away, the static began to fade, but the numbers never left me. They echoed in my mind, a constant whisper, even as the forest disappeared in the rearview mirror. It's been days now, and I'm still hearing them. 1, 3, 7. I can't get them out of my head, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever was out there, whatever sent that signal, knows where I am. And it's not done with me yet. I thought the desert would heal me. Red Rock Canyon was supposed to be a place to clear my head, to sit in silence and let the vast empty land take away the chaos of the last few months. I'd lost everything, my wife, my job, and I needed something, anything, to remind me there was still some peace left in the world. Instead, it felt like I'd driven into a nightmare. I parked the RV at the far end of the campground, as far away from the few other campers as I could get. I wanted solitude, to think, or maybe to stop thinking. I wasn't sure. The sun was setting as I stepped out, casting a deep orange glow across the red sandstone cliffs. It was beautiful, the kind of beauty that made you feel small, like the world was too big for you to matter. Maybe that's what I needed. I'd been driving for hours, with only the occasional crackle of the radio for company. The RV was old, creaking and groaning as I navigated the winding roads into the canyon. It had seen better days, much like me. As I stretched, a low rumble came from under the hood. "Great," I muttered, giving the RV a half-hearted kick. The engine had been acting up for days, but I figured I could deal with it later. I wasn't here for that. I was here to get away, to let the emptiness of the desert swallow me whole. That night, after I'd settled in, I sat outside the RV, staring up at the stars. Out here, away from the city, the sky was incredible, clear, endless. But as the stars twinkled overhead, I noticed something strange. At first, I thought they were planes, blinking in and out far above the canyon. But then they moved too fast, too erratically. I leaned forward, squinting. There were 3 of them, glowing faintly blue, darting through the sky in impossible patterns. They weren't planes. I wasn't sure what they were. I stood up, straining my neck to follow their path as they circled overhead. They blinked off one by one, and the desert was silent again. Just stars, I told myself, even though I knew it wasn't true. The next morning, I woke up to find the RV's battery almost dead. My phone, which I'd left charging overnight, hadn't gained a single bar. I tried turning the engine over, but all I got was a dull click. My chest tightened. Being stranded in the middle of the desert wasn't part of the plan. I had enough food and water for a few days, sure, but the isolation was starting to feel less like a retreat and more like a trap. Milo's RV was parked a few spots down, his beat-up RV sitting in the shade of a large rock formation. He waved me over as I stepped out of mine, a wide grin on his sunburnt face. "Morning," he called. "Beautiful day, huh?" I forced a smile. "Yeah, sure. Hey, you wouldn't happen to have jumper cables, would you?" Milo scratched his scruffy chin, then shook his head. "Sorry, friend, but I can give you a ride into town later if you need help. It's not too far." I thanked him, but something about Milo unsettled me. Maybe it was how relaxed he seemed, like this place wasn't bothering him at all. As I stood there, he tilted his head toward the canyon walls. "You see the lights last night?" he asked. I froze. "Yeah, what were they?" He shrugged, like it was nothing. "Oh, those things. People talk about them all the time. They could be military, could be something else. No one really knows, but they've been around as long as I've been camping out here." I laughed nervously. "Something else, huh?" Milo smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "People say they're not from this world. I don't know about that, but sometimes they follow you. Just don't go too far out at night, and you'll be fine." I forced another laugh, but my stomach churned. Milo's tone was too casual, too accepting. I thanked him again and went back to my RV, trying to shake off the feeling that I was missing something important. The day dragged on, the heat baking the ground beneath my feet. I spent the afternoon hiking a short trail near the campground, trying to clear my head, but the vast emptiness only made me feel more alone. I kept thinking about the lights, about how they'd moved, how they seemed to watch me. That night, they returned. I was sitting outside again, nursing a warm beer and staring at the sky when I saw them, 3 faint blue lights hovering over the canyon. This time, they were closer. Too close. They flickered almost playfully, darting back and forth like they were searching for something. I stood up, my heart pounding. It didn't make sense. Nothing about this place made sense. I backed toward the RV, never taking my eyes off the lights, but as I reached for the door, the lights blinked out. Gone. Just like that. A cold breeze swept through the canyon, and I shivered. It was too quiet. No wind, no insects, nothing. Just the dead, suffocating silence of the desert. Then the RV lights flickered once, twice, and went dark. My chest tightened as I stumbled into the RV, fumbling for the flashlight. I clicked it on, but the beam was weak, barely cutting through the darkness. The electrical panel was dead, and my phone wouldn't turn on. Every piece of technology I had was failing, and I had no idea why. A sudden knock on the door made me jump. "Chris, you okay?" It was Emily, the hiker I'd met earlier that day. She'd pitched her tent nearby, planning to stay for a few nights before heading out. I opened the door, trying to hide my panic. "Yeah, just some electrical issues," I said, forcing a smile. "Everything's dead. I'm guessing the battery's shot." Emily frowned, glancing back at her tent. "That's weird. My phone's dead too, and my flashlight keeps flickering." Her voice was calm, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She felt it too, the strangeness in the air, the weight of the silence. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Do you think it's the lights?" Milo told me about them earlier, said people disappear sometimes. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my breathing steady. "Disappear?" Emily nodded, her gaze drifting toward the canyon. "Yeah, it's mostly stories, but you seemed pretty convinced." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air felt thick, heavy, like the desert was closing in on us. I wasn't sure if I believed in Milo's campfire tales, but the lights, they were real, and they weren't natural. "We should get out of here," Emily said, breaking the silence. "I don't like this." "I can't," I replied. "My RV won't start." She hesitated, then nodded. "Mine either. I tried earlier, but it's completely dead." We stood there, staring at each other, the weight of the situation sinking in. Something was wrong with this place. The lights weren't just an oddity. They were doing something, affecting everything around us. And we were stuck miles from any help. "We'll wait till morning," I said, trying to sound confident. "Maybe it's just a temporary glitch. We'll figure it out." Emily didn't look convinced, but she nodded and headed back to her tent. I locked the RV door behind her, though I wasn't sure what good it would do. That night, I barely slept. The silence was oppressive, like a blanket wrapped too tight around me. Every creak of the RV, every gust of wind made my heart race. I kept waiting for the lights to come back, to hover outside my window, but they didn't. Instead, I woke up sometime in the early hours, drenched in sweat, my head pounding. I sat up, blinking in the darkness. Something was wrong. I glanced at my watch. It was 4 a.m., but that didn't make sense. I'd checked the time just moments ago, and it had been midnight. Where had the hours gone? I stumbled outside, feeling disoriented. The air was cooler now, the desert's chill settling in. The stars were out, but there was no sign of the lights. My mind was foggy, like I'd been dreaming. But the dust on my boots told me I'd been walking. But where? And why? Panic surged through me. I couldn't remember. Hours were missing, and I had no idea what had happened. The lights were playing with us, toying with our sense of reality. I ran toward Emily's tent, calling her name, but when I got there, she was gone. Her tent was empty, her pack still there, but she was nowhere to be found. "Emily!" I shouted, my voice echoing off the canyon walls. Nothing. The only sound was the wind. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But the lights, the missing time, it all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. We weren't alone. I sprinted back to my RV, slamming the door behind me, and tried the engine again. To my shock, it roared to life. The headlights flickered on, and I didn't hesitate. I jammed the gear shift into drive and tore out of the campsite, gravel kicking up behind me as I sped down the winding canyon road. I glanced in the rearview mirror for just a second. I saw them, the blue lights, hovering in the distance, watching me leave. I didn't stop driving until I hit the outskirts of Las Vegas. The neon lights of the city felt like a lifeline. But even then, as I pulled into a gas station, my hands shaking, I couldn't shake the feeling that the lights were still out there, waiting. And I wasn't sure if I'd really escaped at all. "6 months in the Smokies. 6 months. 6 whole months without touching a drop." I should have been proud, right? But sitting alone in this RV, deep in the Great Smoky Mountains, I didn't feel proud. I felt restless, empty, even the kind of empty that creeps up on you, settling in your bones when there's nothing but the sound of your own thoughts bouncing around your skull. This trip was supposed to be a celebration, a gift to myself for staying clean. I thought the solitude would help me clear my head, maybe give me some perspective. The Smokies had always been a place of peace for me. My dad used to take me camping here when I was a kid, back when life was simple. before the bottle got its hooks into me. I pulled out my phone, flicking through pictures of those old trips. My thumb hesitated over the last photo of my dad and me standing by a roaring campfire. That was before everything went to hell, before the drinking became my escape from everything I couldn't face. The phone buzzed, pulling me back to the present. It was my brother Jake, checking in as usual. "Hey, man," he said when I answered. "How's the trip? You hanging in there?" Jake was always the responsible one. Clean cut, married with kids, a steady job. He'd been my lifeline after the wreckage of my addiction. I owed him more than I could ever repay. "Yeah, it's good," I lied. "Just me and the trees. Peaceful." "You staying out of trouble?" I chuckled. "I'm not exactly near any temptations out here," I said. I didn't tell him about the bottle I'd brought with me. It sat in the back of the RV, unopened but still there, just in case. A cruel comfort. I'd stared at it more than once already, the amber liquid calling to me in the quiet. "Good to hear," Jake said, though I could hear the doubt in his voice. "Just keep your head straight, all right? I know it's tough being out there alone, but you got this. Call me if you need anything." "I will. Thanks." I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the bed. The sun was setting outside, casting long shadows through the trees. The sky faded from a soft orange to deep purple, and with it, the familiar sense of isolation began to settle in. The first night in the Smokies should have been serene, but as soon as the darkness took over, I felt it. The unease. The forest around me was too quiet. It was like it was holding its breath. No wind, no rustling leaves, just the faint crackle of my campfire outside. I sat at the picnic table near the fire, trying to relax, but the silence only seemed to grow heavier. I poked at the flames with a stick, hoping they'd somehow keep the stillness at bay. Then I heard it, a whistle, faint at first, like a breeze cutting through the trees, but unmistakably human. I froze, listening. It was tuneless, just a single drawn-out note that seemed to float through the air. I scanned the tree line, but there was nothing. No movement. No one else was supposed to be this far out. I'd parked in a secluded area of the park, away from the main trails. The whistling continued, soft but constant. "Probably just the wind," I muttered to myself, but even as I said it, I knew that wasn't true. It didn't sound like wind. It sounded deliberate. I stood, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling, and slowly circled the fire. I kept the flames between me and the trees, my eyes darting between the dark shapes of the pines. The whistle came again, louder this time, closer. My heart hammered in my chest, the familiar anxiety clawing its way up my throat. "Who's there?" I called, my voice breaking the thick silence. No response, just another long drawn-out whistle. I grabbed my flashlight from the RV and swept the beam through the trees. The light cut through the darkness, but all I saw were shadows. No footsteps, no crunch of leaves, just that damn whistling drifting through the trees like a ghost. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. It had to be nothing, right? Just a trick of the wind. The mountains could be strange like that, especially at night. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The bottle of whiskey in the back of the RV started to look more and more appealing, but I shoved that thought down. I wasn't here for that. Not this time. To clear my head, I went for a hike, following a trail that wound through the dense forest. The air was crisp, the smell of pine and damp earth filling my lungs. For a while it worked. I could almost forget about the night before. Almost. That's when I saw the first marking. It was carved into the bark of a tree, a rough, jagged symbol that looked like a spiral or maybe an eye. I couldn't tell. It didn't look natural, though. It felt intentional, like a warning. I ran my fingers over it, the grooves deep and uneven. I kept walking, but the further I went, the more of the symbols I saw. Spirals, faces, strange runes carved into the trees, all leading deeper into the woods. It felt like they were guiding me somewhere, though I wasn't sure I wanted to find out where. That night, the whistling returned. I was sitting by the fire again, trying to keep my mind off the bottle, when the sound came drifting through the trees. This time it wasn't soft, it was louder, closer. I stood up, flashlight in hand, and scanned the forest. My heart pounded in my ears, my mouth went dry. The whistling seemed to circle the campsite, moving slowly but deliberately. It was all I could hear, filling the silence like a haunting lullaby. I turned, and that's when I saw him. Standing just beyond the tree line was a figure. A man, gaunt and pale, his hollow eyes fixed on me. He stood motionless, his lips pursed as he whistled that same eerie, tuneless note. "Hey!" I called, my voice cracking. "What do you want?" The figure didn't respond. He just stood there, watching me. The whistling grew louder, more insistent, cutting through the night air like a knife. I took a step toward him, but as soon as I moved, he turned and disappeared into the trees. My hands were shaking. I wasn't sure if it was fear or something else, something deeper. I felt the urge to chase him, to follow that haunting sound, but my legs refused to move. I stayed by the fire until dawn, too scared to go back inside the RV. The next day, I tried to leave. I packed up my gear, grabbed the keys to the RV, and decided I'd had enough of the Smokies. But when I tried to start the engine, it wouldn't turn over, just a dull click. I swore under my breath, popped the hood, and checked the battery. Everything looked fine, but the damn thing wouldn't start. I tried calling Jake, but my phone was dead. I'd charged it the night before, but now it was completely drained. No signal, no service, nothing. The forest around me felt suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting just beyond the trees. The whistling started again, faint at first, then growing louder like a taunting melody. I grabbed the bottle from the back of the RV. I wasn't going to drink it. Not yet. But holding it made me feel better, more in control, as if I could use it as a weapon somehow. That night, the stranger came back. I woke up to the sound of whistling, loud, sharp, right outside the RV. I sat up, heart pounding, and looked out the window. He was standing by the fire pit, his pale face illuminated by the flames. His eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, and that awful whistling filled the air, pressing in on me from all sides. He took a step toward the RV, and I felt the panic rise in my chest. I grabbed the bottle, holding it like a club, and stumbled outside. The air was freezing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whistling pierced through my skull, making it hard to think. I raised the bottle, ready to throw it, but then something stopped me. For the first time in days, I heard something else, a voice, faint but real. Jake's voice. "Nick, don't do it." I blinked, shaking my head. The stranger was gone. The whistling had stopped, and there, in the silence, I realized what I had been about to do. The bottle slipped from my hands and shattered on the ground. I dropped to my knees, gasping for air, the weight of everything crashing down on me. The whistling was gone, but the fear, the isolation, it wasn't something I could run from. Not out here. Not anywhere. When the sun rose, I tried the RV again. This time, it started. I drove out of the Smokies that morning, not looking back. The whistling stayed behind, lost in the trees, but the memory of it, the temptation, would stay with me. 6 months sober. But this trip taught me something I hadn't been ready to face. Some demons don't live in bottles. They live in the silence, in the spaces we create for ourselves when we're trying to hide from the world. It was still dark when I arrived at Devil's Tower. The silhouette of the monolith rose above the horizon like a jagged alien structure. The first light of dawn barely touched the sky, but the outline was unmistakable. This place had always felt otherworldly, as if it didn't belong to the same earth the rest of us walked on. I parked the RV in the farthest corner of the campground, vast away from the few other visitors scattered throughout the park. I wanted isolation. Needed it, actually, after months of losing myself in work and failing to fix my crumbling marriage. I thought this trip might offer me some clarity. If nothing else, I had my research to keep me focused. Legends of Devil's Tower had fascinated me for years, but one in particular always stuck out. The legend of the Watcher. Native tribes in the region spoke of a spirit that guarded the tower, a being that offered ancient knowledge to those who sought it, but demanded a steep price in return. As a history professor obsessed with ancient folklore, I couldn't resist the lure of that story. I had come to Wyoming to dig deeper into those legends, hoping to uncover something, anything, that might be hiding in the shadows of the tower. I stepped out of the RV, the crisp morning air biting at my skin. The towering spires of pine trees loomed around me, creating an unsettling sense of isolation. I unpacked my gear, set up camp, and grabbed my notebook. The plan was simple: hike around the base of the tower, take some notes, and maybe, just maybe, find something that would finally make all the pieces click. As I set out toward the trail that led to the tower, I passed an older man in a park ranger uniform, grizzled with deep lines etched into his face. His eyes were sharp, though, alert in a way that made me feel like he saw more than the average person. "Morning," he said, tipping his hat. "Morning," I replied, glancing briefly at his name tag. "Tom, you here for the sights or something else?" His tone was casual, but there was an edge to it. I hesitated. "Research, mostly. I'm looking into some of the old Native American stories about the tower." He nodded slowly, his gaze flicking toward Devil's Tower. "The Watcher, huh?" I stopped. I hadn't mentioned that specific legend. He chuckled softly. "Everyone comes looking for something. But you do well to leave the Watcher alone, son. Some things don't like being disturbed." I tried to brush off his warning with a nervous laugh. "You don't really believe that, do you, Tom?" He didn't smile. "Doesn't matter what I believe. Just be careful. People who go digging too deep around here sometimes find more than they bargain for." With that, he turned and walked back toward the ranger station, leaving me standing there with a pit forming in my stomach. I told myself it was just local superstition, the kind of thing park rangers said to spook tourists. But as I turned my eyes back to the tower, the weight of his words lingered. By midday, I was deep into my hike, circling the base of the tower, taking notes on the surrounding landscape. The towering rock formation loomed overhead, casting long shadows over the forest below. I felt dwarfed by it, like a child standing at the feet of a giant. That's when I noticed the eyes. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a glimmer of sunlight catching on something in the trees. But then I saw them again, faint, glowing orbs between the branches. They were high up, too high to be an animal, and they followed my every movement. I stopped walking, my heart pounding. The eyes didn't blink, didn't move, just hovered there, watching. I wanted to dismiss them as some kind of wildlife, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more behind them, something intelligent. Forcing myself to continue, I kept walking, occasionally glancing over my shoulder to see if the eyes were still there. They were always just far enough away to keep me wondering, but close enough that I could feel their presence. When I finally made it back to camp, the unease hadn't left me. I sat by the RV, trying to write in my notebook, but my mind kept drifting back to the eyes and the trees, the way they'd followed me, never straying too far, but never coming closer either. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the campground in shadow. The tower loomed in the distance, a dark silhouette against the purple sky. The fire I'd started crackled weakly, the flames flickering as if they, too, were uncertain about staying here. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. I was a rational man, after all, a professor, a skeptic. But as the night wore on, that skepticism started to feel more like denial. The wind rustled through the trees, and the fire guttered low. Then, just as the last light of the day faded, I heard it. A whistle. It started softly, almost like the wind, but it was too distinct, too deliberate, a single drawn-out note that drifted through the trees, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I stood, scanning the darkness. The fire cast faint light around the camp. "Hello," I called, though I wasn't sure what I expected to hear in return. The whistle came again, sharper this time, closer. I grabbed my flashlight and swung the beam into the trees, but there was nothing, no movement, just the oppressive stillness of the forest. The whistling stopped, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. I sat back down, but sleep didn't come easily that night. Every creak of the RV, every rustle of the trees, made me bolt upright, expecting to see those glowing eyes or hear that eerie whistle again. I told myself it was just my imagination, just nerves from being out here alone. But the uneasy feeling stuck with me, settling deep in my bones. The next day, I set out again, hoping to shake the paranoia that had settled over me. I hadn't gone far when I ran into Julie, a solo traveler I'd briefly noticed the day before. She was standing at the edge of the trail, staring up at Devil's Tower, a strange look on her face. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said as I approached, though her tone didn't match her words. There was something off about the way she spoke, like her mind was somewhere else entirely. "Yeah," I replied. "I've been hiking around, looking into the old legends. You know about the Watcher?" She turned to me, a slow smile spreading across her face. "The Watcher?" You're looking for it? I nodded, uneasy. It's just research. Julie's smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. The Watcher doesn't like to be found. You know, it watches, but it doesn't want to be seen. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words stuck in my throat. Something about her was wrong. She seemed too calm, too knowing. The way she stared at me made my skin crawl. Before I could say anything else, she turned and walked back toward her campsite, leaving me standing there, heart pounding for reasons I couldn't explain. That night, the whistling returned, louder this time, persistent. I sat by the fire, gripping my flashlight, eyes darting between the trees. The whistle circled the campsite, moving closer than further away, like it was testing me, toying with me. Then, just beyond the flickering light of the fire, I saw him. A figure, tall and gaunt, standing at the edge of the woods. His face was pale, hollow-eyed, and his mouth was pursed as the tuneless whistle drifted from his lips. My throat tightened. "Who are you?" I asked. The figure didn't answer. He just stood there, whistling that same eerie note. My chest tightened with a sudden surge of panic. I stumbled back toward the RV, tripping over a rock and falling to the ground. When I looked up, he was gone. I scrambled inside, locking the door behind me. The sound of my breath was too loud in the confined space. The next morning, I found footprints around the campsite, small indentations in the dirt, leading in circles around the fire. They hadn't been there before. On the final night, I couldn't take it anymore. The dreams of Devil's Tower had become unbearable, nightmares of the stone pulsing, breathing like a living thing. I dreamt of eyes, hundreds of them, watching me from the shadows, always watching. I had to go to the tower. I had to see it up close. I grabbed my gear and set out under the cover of darkness, the whistle guiding me, pulling me toward the monolith. The trees seemed to close in around me as I walked, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The stars above twisted and shifted, unfamiliar constellations blinking in and out of existence. As I neared the base of the tower, I saw her again. Julie, standing at the foot of the rock, her face pale and her smile too wide. "The Watcher is waiting," she whispered. "It's always been waiting." The whistle grew louder, piercing through my thoughts, driving me forward. I reached the tower, my hands trembling as I touched the cold stone. And then, out of the shadows, the Watcher appeared. It was a massive, shadowy figure, its body indistinguishable from the darkness, but its eyes glowing, burning orbs that stared into me, through me. It didn't speak with words, but its presence filled my mind, offering me ancient knowledge, secrets of the tower, of the universe, of myself. But the price. I could feel it gnawing at the edges of my sanity. The more I listened, the more I realized that accepting its offer would mean losing everything. My mind, my soul, everything that made me, me. I stumbled back, tearing myself away from the Watcher's gaze. The whistle reached a fever pitch, and I ran. The ground beneath me shifted and warped as the world collapsed around me. I barely made it back to the RV. When I crossed the threshold, the whistling stopped. The forest fell silent. I drove away as the first light of dawn touched the sky. The image of the Watcher's eyes burned into my mind. I knew I would never be the same.